Oj, Triglav, moj dom, kako si krasan, kako me izbavljaš iz niskih rana. Po letni vročini na skalne vrhe, da tam si spočinil samotni srce.
Described as an organic movement by the people with no central leadership, the Yellow Vest protests across the streets of France have received little to no coverage here in the United States. Local media alerts the French people of events in their town, but outside of Europe, Americans seem unaware of the sometimes violent demonstrations in the City of Lights. So joining me now to discuss the media silence, investigative journalist Ben Swann. Ben, so this weekend, protests got ugly again on the streets of Paris. Police fired water cannons and tear gas at the Yellow Vests. Now, given that this is the 9th consecutive weekend of protests, why aren't we hearing more about this movement stateside?
Well, look, I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think the reason that our media does not talk about the Yellow Vest movement is because they don't like it for a couple of reasons. The biggest being why the Yellow Vest movement began in the first place, which is because of fuel taxes related to climate change. If you reversed it, and if the Yellow Vest protests were happening because the people of France wanted to fix climate change by increasing fuel taxes, our media would cover it. But I would submit that. But they don't cover it because they don't like what the initial push came from. They didn't like that. And then they also don't like where it's gone from there, which is an anti-globalist and increasingly anti-EU movement that's taking place in France right now, very similar to this Brexit issue.
And, you know, Americans, we're usually so enamored, right, by the city of Paris. We often romanticize the city. It's all over our movies. But when it comes to what might be viewed as kind of, I guess, negative news, Americans really have no clue about what's going on in France. Why do you think that is?
Well, again, I think it goes back to this idea of this kind of anti-globalist movement that's taking place in France. Look, this is not a movement from one party. It's not a movement that has any kind of recognized leadership. It is truly a grassroots movement. And I think that makes anyone who's an elitist, it makes them uncomfortable with what this means because there's no control over it. There's no message to be spun, and it can go anywhere. And I think that makes, media, it makes big corporations, and it makes politicians, all of them, very uncomfortable.
Right. I think it's important to highlight that it's the big corporations who own the American media.
Absolutely.
So, good point to make there. Now, on the flip side, though, Ben, the press is being attacked there lately, covering these protests. This weekend, journalists became the target of, as you said, what grew to become anti-government protests. Could it be that the Yellow Vests actually don't want the coverage?
I don't think it's that they don't want the coverage. From what I have read, some of the interviews that did take place, I don't think it's that they don't want coverage. I think it's that they want what they perceive as honest coverage, right? The same problem that we have here in the United States, where a lot of people who are involved in these protests say that the French media is dishonest, does not tell the truth about what's happening, shows pictures of violence and portrays the movement as wholly and completely violent, as opposed to seeking answers to change things. They also have complaints that they say that police violence is not portrayed in the media and not shown in the media, but it happens on a regular basis during these protests. So they feel there's a very one-sided, slanted coverage coming from French media, very similar to the complaints that we've seen from protesters here in the United States when we've seen things like the Black Lives Matter protests, Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party protests.
Gotcha. It sounds like America has exported its media troubles overseas the other direction. Now, lastly, why do you think it's important for folks to be informed of such uprisings, such movements?
Well, look, when you ignore these movements, you're ignoring the root cause of them, right? These movements aren't happening because everyone in France is bored and wants something to do every weekend, like let's go tear something down or let's go protest in the streets. To bring people into the streets, especially people who are, these are not professional protesters. Everyday people take to the streets to protest. And as you mentioned, 9 consecutive weekends. It demonstrates there are underlying problems here that are being ignored. And so when the media refuses to talk about it, the reason they don't want to talk about it is they don't want to deal with the underlying issues of overtaxation, of lack of upward mobility, of the disappearing middle class. It's happening in Europe. It happens in the United States. And the media is ignoring the problems that are causing people to step up and say, This has to change.
Definitely easier to just not cover it, not talk about it, than to actually have to dig in. All right, as always, thank you for your insights, my friend Ben Swann.
Thank you.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.